one.
I can hear my neighbor crying. I can't breathe. You got a right, you got a right.
You got a right to the tree of life. You got a right, you got a right. You got a right to the tree of life. You're right, so right, so right, so right. You got a right to the tree of life.
You got a right, got a right.
You got a right to the tree of life. You got a right, you got a right. You got a right to the tree of life. You're right, you're right, you're right, you're right. You got a right to the tree of life.
You got a right, you got a right.
You got a right to the tree of life. You got a right to the tree of life. You got a right to the tree of life. Gonna sing a song of freedom.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me, over me.
That which touches me most is that I had a chance to work with people, passing on to others that which was passed on to me, and to me young people confer. They have the courage where we stand, and if I can but shed some light as they carry us through the gap. We who believe in a freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom
till it
comes. Not needed to clutch for power, not needed to light. To shine on me, I want to be one in the number. Now we who believe in freedom cannot rest. No, we who believe in freedom till it comes. Can't keep the sun from rising when morning comes around. Can't keep the birds from flying, they're born to leave the ground. Can't keep the boys from singing when our heart is freedom bound. Rolling strong and singing a song of freedom. Ooh, ah, ooh, ooh, ah, ooh, ooh, ah, ooh.
And the sisters on their way, they won't stand aside today. I'm on the prize, freedom is on the rise, rolling strong and singing a song of freedom.
On the line, they're gonna lift that freedom sign.
And they can't kick us around. They can't stop this freedom sound. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Rolling strong and singing a song of freedom. Rolling strong and singing a song of freedom.
It's been a long time coming,
but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes, it will.
Man, praise the Lord.
Amen. And praise the Lord. Bruce.
Yes.
Is that the kind of energy that we experience in Ohio?
Yes. and it's great as I listen to the group sing, I'm reminded that these were the type of songs that was a soundtrack and a backdrop and the spiritual nourishment for those of us who were struggling on the front line.
Amen.
And I have to ask myself the question, where is that now? What happened to church music that we used to use to feed our souls when we were locked up in jails and we were getting hit with billy bats out here in the streets?
Yes.
But
Yes.
we talk about that, but I'm uplifted. And yes, that's the kind of energy that we need to do the work that we're doing.
Amen, my brother. I just wanted to greet everyone, to say to you that I felt your prayers on yesterday. I'm thankful to be with you today. The work continues because we can't breathe. And we're looking at racism as a moral, spiritual, and public health crisis. I am indeed happy to have Dr. Dean Emily M. Towns with us this morning. So thankful that many of those who presented, and particularly our keynote speaker, Dr. Joy Bostic, is with us this morning. My good friend and person who stood in for me on yesterday, Reverend Dr. Geraldine Eulenberg, is with us this morning. And we're expecting this talkback time to be a time when we really move ourselves towards solution. I must say a hearty thank you to the planning committee, those of you who hung in there with us throughout the couple of months that we've been planning this. Particular thanks goes to my dear friend, Howard Wiley, who helped take the lead and who introduced me to some phenomenal leaders that I hope to continue dialogue with and continue to work with and to share resources with to the best of my capacity. But today, I must say, the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative at Vanderbilt Divinity School is enriched by this collaboration. You've done a yeoman's job of taking the mantle, running with it, and doing great work. And I'm so very, very delighted to pass the mic over to Reverend Bruce Butcher, someone whom I have grown to love and know is in the front lines of the fight. Take it away, Bruce.
Thank you, Dr. Smallwood. And I want to thank you, not for this moment, for the work that you do and the work that the Vanderbilt School of Divinity is doing in this initiative to take a mobile institute all over the nation to work to find solution and to connect much needed resources, including the people resource for what we are up against as a people in regard to voting and regard to other activities of freedom that will give us freedom in this land that seems to hate us so. I want to thank Professor Howard Wiley. When I get finished with this, I'm going to privately have a few words with him. But I appreciate challenges. Most of us who have served as moderators and putting this together, we fuss, but we would be nothing without this level of work that we do. But I want to thank him for thinking of me in this endeavor and got me on board early on. I'd like to thank Dr. Joy Bostic, our keynote speaker. She was the bomb. What she had to offer, we need to study. And I would take this time to share with all of those who are listening that you can find all of the recordings of these sessions that took place beginning Thursday night and the 2 sessions yesterday and probably this session. You can find that recording on Vanderbilt School of Divinity webpage. Is that correct?
Public Theology and Racial Justice.
Public Theology and Racial Justice. And
we'll put it in the chat.
Okay, very good, very good, very good. So I've had the opportunity to sit in on every session and listen and take notes. And the thing that I come out with, and I'm not an alarmist or a pessimist, but African people who live in America, we're under dire straits. You might want to ask the question, are we better off in 2021 than we were 100 years ago in 1921? And in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. We had more land. in 1921 than we have now. We had more racial pride in 1921 than we have now, but we're certainly up against the ropes. But I want to start this talk back, and please talk back and chop it up with me. And if I have to lob some grenades your way that are provocative to get you to say something, I don't have any problem doing that. But as I listen, one biblical framework that came to me is this first 12 chapters of Exodus. Because if you look at that, there are some parallels between what was happening to the people of Israel and what was happening to us. And I'm saying that because we may find some solutions, the same solution that they found. In fact, it's the solution found them that we might be able to go forward. But let me introduce and frame also this discussion with this piece of news. Since November the 4th, 2020, there have been 361 bills introduced in 47 states to restrict and repress the vote. It's nationwide. In Ohio, there's a recent movement by the GOP back to overhaul the Ohio voting laws. And it could potentially, and it most likely, could reduce early voting and prohibit such things like ballot drops and weekend voting and souls to the polls. And in other words, every tactic that we have used in the last 8 years or longer, they are deciding that they want to change the rules because we have learned the rules and we have learned the game and we are beating them at their own game. So when that's the case, they have decided to get in new rules. That's what losers do. When you lose it, let's change the rules up. But what we want to do in these few moments, at some point, we might digress or stray a little bit, but what we want to walk away with today is what's some concrete, real things that we can do to come out of this. Because where do we go from here? What do I do when I get off this Zoom call today at 12 o'clock Central Time and 1 o'clock Eastern? What's some things, some concrete, tangible things that I can do that can make a difference and that can impact our situation in a positive way? So, having said that, let's go back. We talked about, Dr. Bostic talked about this idea of emplacement, where racist, white supremacists attempt to put things up in place to reinforce white supremacy and to keep the power relationship that exists between them and those who they oppress, to keep that intact. And their efforts, their violent efforts, including from over a century, from lynchings to the things that we are facing now with the police being used as a tool, a violent tool of oppression and to hold us down. So we appreciate Dr. Bostic for bringing that point out. And the fact that what we're up against when we're dealing with white supremacy, we're really dealing primarily with white masculine egos. And the fact that they are afraid to let go of power and to let go of position and to let go of privilege. And so, even the most rational white supremacists, when they're dealing with something other than this, they may appear rational until they get to the point of losing privilege and losing power and losing position, then they become irrational. So that's why we see some of the most wildest statements coming out of the mouths of some of these elected leaders who are racist, because they're attempting to hold on to power. So we thank Dr. Bostic for that. We thank the session on race and gender, and what really came out for me on that is that the whites believed in that. We didn't call it manifest destiny. It didn't come out specifically, but they felt like manifest destiny is you feel like you have the God-given right to take someone's land and to remove the inhabitants of that land that you might establish your own nation. And it was the notion of manifest destiny that had white people to come from the East Coast to the West to enslave or to commit acts of genocide against the native people, the indigenous people, the Amerindians in this country, and to establish this nation, and to import African people as slaves to build the nation. So we are the builders of this nation. But what happens as a Black person when your economic value in the eyes of the oppressor diminishes? What happens when you can know, when they don't lead you any longer to chop the wood and to chop the cotton and to chop the tobacco? And then what happens to you? Well, we are living in what happens. They begin to house you. They begin to make laws where you are criminalized, and then they lock you up. And that becomes a whole industry. So that's what we are facing. Some of the things we are facing. And I would submit that one of the easiest, convenient tools that we have to change some of these items is the vote, the power to vote. And I want to say before I give it up so I can hear some comments that we are not a powerless people. We're just the people right now with low power. We're not without power, we just have low power. So one of the questions I want to ask is how can we build power? So having said that, I'm going to stop and take a look in the chat. And if anyone cares to respond, I am not in control of the mute button, but I think there should be something where you can raise your hand or you can ask to speak or that type of thing, because this session, this portion is supposed to be an engagement, a dialogue, a debate, a discussion. And so it takes two. Now, I'm prepared to talk for 2 hours, but I prefer not to. So let me hear some from you. Anyone?
Well, good morning. I couldn't see where to raise my hand, so I hope you don't mind if I just start talking. How you doing, brother? Thank you so much. Sister. Okay, thank you so much, and thank you to our Hugh people for bringing the invocation of the spirit and the ancestors to create sacred space for us to engage in this conversation.
Amen.
So I would say that in part, there is a way in which this last election enabled people to see their power, even in the midst of all of the suppression tactics. I mean, Georgia is, an example of that, where people are saying, well, what can we do with our vote? What can we do with what does it mean? And the mobilization that happened, and my dear brother, Reverend Warnock, and I believe folks were praying. I know we had prayer sessions. So the prayer and the way in which people mobilized, but he and Brother Ossoff ran a very focused campaign. They did not become distracted or allow their engagements to be distracted by the foolishness of those who were trying to distract us and to undermine that movement. And the other thing that they did is we're always focusing on Black folks in urban areas and white folks in rural areas. It was Black folks in the rural areas who actually, even though they were fewer numbers, but because they mobilized in those rural areas in Georgia, I know Brother Warnock was going to those rural areas, people came out and voted. And so I think people have, and not only that, but indigenous folks in Pennsylvania and Arizona and Latinx folks. And so there's a way in which we discovered that even in the face of these tactics, that we can rise above that. I mean, and this is going back to sort of all of the ways in which, activists have tried to continue the fight to vote even in the face of these tactics. So I just want to say, so the question for me would be, how do we continue to mobilize on that experience, that people actually experience that Georgia made a difference between the continued insanity where now, you know, we're actually getting attention to Black farmers. And I mean, there's things that are happening because of that change. The other thing from a biblical standpoint, we have to sort of think about in terms of this kind of intersectionality and interconnection is and that's part of what my message is how are we thinking about difference, even within the Black community? How are we thinking about religious difference that people bring? So when we talk about Exodus, which has always been a powerful metaphor and a way of thinking about Black experience, we also had to think about the link between Exodus and the manifest destiny, right? That there were people in the land
right.
that often are rendered invisible. So Black people have to make sure we don't replicate that kind of silence and rendering others invisible, even in the face of our use of our power. So our use of power has to be interconnected in a way that we understand the diversity of the spirit, the diversity of the ways in which people organize, even in terms of the music. I mean, that's what was my point when you talk, where are those songs? Well, my argument is the refrain from Kendrick Lamar's All Right is it echoes those spirituals. That's what we do. We take songs and we adapt them and we reframe them. And so the art and the aesthetics and the movement that's been a part of Black Lives Matter, and that's what we have to do intergenerationally, is continue to sort of affirm the ways in which those aesthetics continue to be used and the way in which the spirit continues to be tapped into, and then find ways for us intergenerationally to continue to adapt and combine all of the ways that we've used those resources.
Thank you. Because it's interesting, because I worked in the campaign in the state of Pennsylvania and in the state of Georgia as an organizer and political consultant, particularly with clergy persons. And one of the things I discovered out of that, two things. One, the slowness of the established church to get on board. And once we did, it started making a difference. But secondly, the desire of the youth to want to be engaged and involved. And as I was working with the churches, and they were attempting to discourage young people from activism, and I was going the other way. I'm like, no, they ready. Well, what if they're not old enough to vote? Then they're young enough to learn. So when it's voting time, they can get out there and know what to do. So it's interesting that you should bring these things up, but these are some of the things that we can get in our power is engaging young people in the political process, from political education. We used to call it civics, to knowing how government works, to actually taking them with you to vote so they can see it in action, and even the part about the protest. Now, people raised Cain when Dr. King decided to use youth in the protest action. But it was the youth of the protest action, along with a couple of other things, these graphic, visible actions that begin to turn the tide, the moral tide against segregationists and against white supremacy in the South. But of course, we know now the South begins once you cross the Canadian border, as we can see with what's happening all across this nation, most recently in the state of Minnesota, but every state. It used to be below the Mason-Dixon line, but the Mason-Dixon line has moved up to where Canada begins. So it's good that we can recognize that, we can approach our young people, because we always say that in the future, let's make them the present as well as the future.
Bruce, I couldn't agree with you more, but I really want us to think a little bit about the timeline that was involved in that Birmingham experience.
Yes.
And let's really be focused on the fact that if this is to be a solution, we need to have strategies. One of the things that concerns me greatly is that we've got folk operating in silos, all for the same cause.
Yes.
We need to come together, bring that synergy of what the young people want to do and what the old folk want to do, and how it is that we operate in such a fashion. I mean, we've got to divorce ourselves from some of those old narratives that keep us from joining our children
Yes.
From engaging them. We have so many people who are down on young people because of how they wear their hair, how they wear their clothes.
Yeah.
And I'm so sick of that. I'm sick of the things that we use that white folks have basically put in place to cause us to be divided.
And the agent that has been most active in this repression in our community has been the Black church. Because you have to ask, where's the Black church in all of this? The people that the Black church has rejected, the LBGQ community, anything that don't, if you're not middle class with a job and a suit, you're not welcome in the church.
And that's because we're hung up on politics of respectability. But let me say this, there is a place for respectability. It's just that it can't hamper our advancement.
Right.
That's right. That be the concern. Our ultimate reality has to be about equity and diversity, true, but most definitely our inclusivity.
Yes.
Well, I like to point this out, and this will be part of ongoing conversation, because I think what's happening in University Circle, what can happen in University Circle in Cleveland, and people who are already making some of these links can also be resources for us. But as Brother Wiley discussed on when it was announced Thursday, I'm coming in as the inaugural Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I'm also a member of Mount Zion UCC, where Reverend Paul Sadler is the pastor. And we're also sort of thinking about how we can bring diversity, equity, and inclusion in as a part of our ministerial force. And this church has been, and the reason why I joined the church is because of the inclusiveness of the LGBTQ community. And I don't even know if we talk about that much, but LGBTQ folks are on the deacon board, they're on the ministerial board, they're just part of the community. It's not even anything that we're deconstructing and reconstructing, it just is. And so that's part of the reason why I love being a part of this community, because, and they're doing a jobs program, which goes across class, that really, is big church, is mega church ministry. And so what I'm saying is that, and then I see my students, and I think but what you may have said this before, is our students let us know how unsafe they feel on campus, how they're feeling. And so we've got to figure out and when you sort of talk about the spiritual, it is that disconnect with the church that young people feel. And so churches are trying to bring young people in and say what's wrong with them, where the young people are saying, well, what's wrong with the church? Because the church, oftentimes, not in all cases, because many of my colleagues who went to Union are doing amazing ministry and finding ways to connect. But we've got to figure out, again, going back to, my space, what is our gospel imperative? The gospel imperative is the emplacement. If everybody fits into the binaries in the placement, if that's your point, then you can't create emancipatory space. You can't do liberation, because what you're trying to do is confine people within your comfort level of what people ought to be. But if we're really about emancipation and really about liberation, we got to find a way to connect across difference and say, look, whatever you may be and whatever I may be, it's about liberation. So what do we need to do to get there? But I'm saying that to say is, there are connections we're starting to make very deeply in University Circle that can really bring cutting edge connections to the way we do that kind of equity, liberation, religious, spiritual work that can provide another model, but we can also be influenced by other models. So just wanted to lift that up.
Dr. Bostic, there is a request that you repeat where you are.
Case Western Reserve University, Cleveland, Ohio.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Bostic. There was a gentleman, Demario Cooper, and I invited Demario Cooper to this Zoom because I've been working with Demario Cooper since at least 2010, if not before. And Demario Cooper is I'm trying to find my notes with it. He is connected with
Center for Popular Democracy.
The Center for Popular Democracy. And he is the national director of a certain division of that. But I met him working with the Mahoney Valley Organizing Collaborative.
Yeah. And
that's one of the hardest hit areas in Northeast Ohio, Youngstown in that area. and then to the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, and then to Black Pack and other collaborative groups. So I invited this gentleman because he is one of the leaders that I have known to be on the forefront of positive change in Ohio. Several years back, we had a referendum. We managed to put a referendum on a statewide ballot. Mm-hmm. We registered 200,000 people.
More than that.
We had over 1 million people to vote on the ballot. So I invited him in. I want him to share for a moment, just to give a little bit more. I just sketched it, and then to share with us some of his thoughts, if you would.
So how y'all doing? Nice to see all of the people whose faces are either in the picture or on the screen. I think the one thing I just want to go back to what Dr. Bostic was talking about and kind of what Ms. Smallwood was saying about narrative, and then talk about, I want to start with like Reverend Warnock, right? So Georgia, everybody's excited about Georgia. I was working with Black Pack last year. I know what happened in Georgia, like for real. And it wasn't just like 2020 popped up and then it was like, oh, everybody vote for Georgia. There was a strategy put in place. There's Stacey Abrams. There's another lady, another white lady named Lauren, and there's a lady named Inse. Uh-huh. And like, you need to understand these people to understand what happened in Georgia. And we need to, like, part of what we have to do is start telling a narrative in a way that, like, if we're talking about the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King was not an organizer. Martin Luther King was a leader that an organizer organized into a strategy. And we need to be clear about that, because a lot of times we want to just say Martin Luther King was a leader. He was the organizer. He was the everything. No, Baynard Rustin was the organizer.
There you go.
Right.
He was a queer man, right? And like, then they created a leadership committee, and Martin Luther King was a part of that leadership committee. And then, and you know what I'm saying? We need to understand that. So in Georgia, we also need to understand those same things if we're going to teach young people what's right.
Yeah, go ahead.
So Stacey Abrams created something called NGP, which is New Georgia Project. The New Georgia Project as an institution. Remember, institutions are what win justice, not moments. Movement moments raise issues. Institutions win justice because they have to last as long as those who are oppressors in opposition, right? So NGP was created by Stacey Abrams, and it was created because the ACA was not reaching into rural communities, and they needed a program that would go out and canvass in rural communities and bring people into the ACA, right? So Nsé Ufot gets hired by Stacey Abrams and Lauren, but Nsé came from Ohio. Nsé's an immigrant from Nigeria, but she was a union organizer in Ohio. That's how I met Nsé. So then Nsé goes to Georgia, where she grew up. She goes back to Georgia, and they start building the New Georgia Project. This is like 7 years ago. Because somebody had did the math and was like, if we actually register a bunch of Black people in this state, we're going to have a majority of registered people. And so we need to like take the time to register them, which they did cycles of registering people in the state of Georgia. New Georgia Project ran that voter registration program, and they registered 500,000 people over 6-7 years, 500,000 new registered voters, right? This is what's interesting about it. During this time, Reverend Warnock, you know what Reverend Warnock's doing? Reverend Warnock's the board president of New Georgia Project. He's the board president. And so when he's seeing all this voter registration, right, and he's seeing what's going on, and then they create a strategy to run Reverend Warnock, right? Like, and we got to get out of this thing where we think like Rosa Parks was just tired and sat down on the bus. That's not what happened. That's not what happened. It was a strategy. And they want us to think that these are just like emotional outbursts that happen, and then somebody's angry and that's what starts a movement, because we aren't supposed to understand that our people had a strategy and thought about it and meticulously planned why they did the things they did. And so we got to be very clear about that. We just need to be clear about that, right? Like, that's the thing. So I have been an organizer now for 15 years. I met Pastor Butcher in the middle of that work. I started, like he said, in Youngstown, from Akron, Ohio, but I started in Youngstown, and then we built the thing in Akron, Ohio, and the thing in Youngstown kind of grew to be a statewide organization called the Ohio Organizer Collaborative, and has spent off things like the People's Justice Project, folks who are in Columbus.
Amos Project in Cincinnati.
Yeah, Cincinnati, there's Amos Project, there's People's Justice Project. These things, Amos Project was around for a while, but we started adding capacity to the Amos Project. But we created like the Akron Organizer Collaborative, the People's Justice Project, which is probably the group of people helping organize folks who are on the street around Ma'Khia Bryant right now, right? Like I actually got a call from them folks, but I just like, I'll talk to y'all next week because I'm really in a bad place this week. But to get an understanding when we talk about what we need to do, right? So my organization and the work that I've been doing has been about engaging community. So actually going out, canvassing people, building a volume of list, right, of people who might be interested. Then going back and actually talking with those people, doing one-to-ones, training people how to do one-to-ones, helping organizations build out organizing campaigns and plans, and like actually trying to get people closer and closer to the organization. People need to have a particular set of experiences in order for them to understand, one, the political analysis of what we're doing and why we're trying to do it, and two, to build a relationship to the organization. Y'all know this, if y'all people of faith, y'all run churches, you know that like the experiences that people have either connect them deeply or kind of don't connect them deeply, which is what I heard people talking about earlier. As you walk into a space and I got on a hoodie and some jeans and everybody looking at me crazy, I'm probably not coming back to that space, right? Because there was no experience that connected me to it, or I did not feel at home. So the other thing we do is political education, right? Like one thing our people actually need political education. I like to say a lot of times, like people who were enslaved and stuck on plantations really didn't know where they were. Like, let's like really back up and think about it. Like, we've all seen the map of America. We actually know what Alabama is in relationship to Michigan. But if you were not allowed to read or see a map or see any of this information, you actually just grew up on a piece of land and had no idea where you're at. And after a set of generations, right, you got to think, people think like, oh, this is how it is. Part of the problem that we're dealing with and we're trying to solve right now, and Georgia is looking towards that, part of the problem that we're living is the descendants of those same enslaved people do not know the political map of where they're at. So we're expecting people to move towards freedom when they don't actually have an analysis of how to get north, right? Like you can't go north anymore, but like people don't have a clue. And then there's no breadcrumbs. There's no like moss trees or quilts or anything, right? Like it's just, I'm here as a young person, the descendant of these people who were enslaved, right? And so what we're trying to do is give people the map, right? Like there's a political map that you need to understand. And if your people don't understand it, they won't know why we're doing what we're doing. I talked to NJ like 2 days ago, and I agree with her. And you know what she said? This woman who registered 500,000 people in her state. I have registered and helped register and raise money to register over 350,000 people in the state of Ohio. And like Pastor Butcher said, we put an initiative on the ballot that required us to get 3% from 44 to 88 counties in Ohio to sign a signature to put the thing on a ballot. That added up to 740,000 signatures. And I will tell you right now, I do not care about voting. I care if people vote, but the actual thing about voting, like, it's a strategy for us to get power and liberation. That's what it is. But if people don't understand voting as a strategy, and it's just in the context of like people got beat up for you to vote or killed for you to vote, young kids, people get beat up and killed because they in the fight with their family in front of their yard, right? Like we got to be clear about this. We have to help people understand the strategy. Like you need to understand what all of our children need to understand what precincts, wards, what a municipality is, how laws get changed, what is the executive, legislative, and judicial branch of government, and what do they do? Right? We actually have to have these conversations and really train our people to understand that, because you can graduate. I graduated with a bachelor's degree, and I know people who graduated with PhDs, but they're not teaching this stuff to people. They might know that there's 3 bicameral or 3 branches of government, but they don't know what they do. They don't know what the jobs are. They don't know what the roles are. They don't know the decisions that each of these places make. And so there needs to be a political education that helps people get to that. They need to understand the government structure and how these decisions that get made by people we elect directly impact their lives. directly impacted. We're all this money is about to come for the American, what is it? I always say American Recovery Act. I know it's not the name.
$11 billion on the table.
Yeah, there's billions of dollars about to come, right?
11
And
billion.
people are going to decide where this money goes. And like our folks have no clue that that's what's going on. They don't know that's what's going on. And I mean, the people that I'm running around with, people that we talking to, my friends, like they busy working. And there's no institution or entity that shows up to say it plain to people to help them understand what is going on. Instead, what we do is say something's wrong with you because you don't know what's going on. It's not a failure to structure a system. It's an individual failure because you don't know. And I was in a focus group one time. This dude just stood up and said, like, how am I supposed to know what's going on? I work 3 jobs. I got 4 kids. I'm working. He was like, somebody like y'all, like you need to show up and help me understand what's going on so that I know to vote. And the truth is, no one tells you that they don't know. My mom passed away at this yesterday, 12 years ago. When I first came home, I was living out of the city. I first came home and I was all messed up. And I sat down, my little cousin's coming over my house. My little cousin is like the neighborhood, like medicine man, right? But he come over my house every day. We sit down, we talking. I'm like, propaganda, all this propaganda on TV, propaganda, blah, 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 propaganda. It's literally 6 weeks. He listened to me say propaganda. And then he says something and it makes me think like, hold up, do you know what that word means? I said, Damon, I said, hey, do you know what the word propaganda means? He looked me straight in the face and said, no, I don't. I said, well, why didn't you tell me you didn't know what it meant? He said, because I didn't want you to think I was stupid. Now, the question is, if he don't understand, is that my fault or his fault?
DeMario.
And I'm using these words.
DeMario?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is Howard Wiley. Can I ask you a question at this point?
Absolutely. I'm about to stop talking. I'm
No,
done.
you can. It's not to keep you from talking. I just want to be in dialogue with you on a point, right? What is your solution to that?
To the thing with my cousin?
No, not your cousin, what you said before, in terms of making people aware of the reality that we're trying to the social reality that we're trying to transform, and how that can be done, so that people can be aware. You're saying that people don't know. So, and you said there's no institution and no mechanism to actually help people to understand what needs to happen, right? So I'm asking you, I know you're doing your part, but in terms of the people who are gathered here, as a part of this conversation, do you have any suggestions to implement or to organize or to establish the kind of mechanisms that are necessary to do the work that you're talking about?
Absolutely. I appreciate that question. Thank you. The first thing I would say is there's no shortcuts. So if you think you're about to send something out on Facebook and that's going to bring you a bunch of people, just stop doing that. There's no shortcuts. The only way that we're going to fix this situation is by getting a group of people deciding around your institution, your faith institution or church or whatever that is, deciding what area you gonna claim and just say like this area, and then go talk to every person in that area. Like literally get up like they used to do back in the day and go knock on people's doors, and not to go and tell them like, come to church, but to sit down with them and say, what's going on? Right? Like what's happening in your life? What is happening in this community? This is what we think is happening. Have you heard of this? Do you vote? Are you a voter? There's also programs that can help you look at like people who are and are not voters. It's called the Voter Action Network. It's a band. You can look it up. I think the first step is that we got to get out of the mind state that we think technology is going to save us from the relationships we need to build with people in the community. We have to build relationships. And then the idea is that you bring those relationships into your space and you have an open, iterative dialogue with them about what's going on. Right. And then what we normally do, and we know like people need to be educated. We know people need to be educated. We are one, I believe in something called relational organizing, which is really just organizing. It's what it is. It's what our ancestors have always done. You have to find people in the community that are leaders in the community. And I'm not talking about people with titles, because sometimes people with titles are not the leaders. I'm talking about who people listen to. And then like create a training that gets those core people, those actual people who can move other people, to get in online around an analysis that's happening in their community, right? And then you create a campaign strategy, because what we need to be getting to, and there's no shortcuts to this, what we need to be getting to is a winning majority. We need a winning majority. And that is what we need across our community. That means what I'm saying when I say a winning majority. And we have it. This is the thing, we actually have it, right? When we look at elections, you look at previous elections and you see who won and who lost, and find out what's the average turnout of an election. Like in the state of Ohio, I know in gubernatorial elections, it's probably going to be around 4.7 to 5 million on the high end that actually votes, right? So what I need to do is look at, okay, I need to get to this win number. We actually would have did that with the ballot initiative. And the ballot initiative was a great ballot initiative. It was reinvestment before people was talking about reinvestment, because it was about decreasing the prison population and increasing money that went to drug treatment, trauma recovery, mental health services. We actually ran into a state Supreme Court justice who like wrote her opinions on letterhead, and that's a whole nother conversation. But we have to start thinking about how do we win in our areas? Even if you just look at the previous, like your mayor, wherever you at, the mayor won by 200,000 votes. And there's 30,000 people who don't even vote and aren't registered in your city. That means that if you target those 30,000, which are not going to be the middle class people, because middle class people vote, it's going to be poor and working class people. But if you put together a plan to engage that 30,000 and say, okay, look, out of this 30,000, we really only going to move 5% of them. But that 5% is going to be the margin of victory for the mayor or city council or whoever else is the ones making the actual decisions. Then basically it's a shakedown after that. If you actually have a winning number, trust me, politicians are very clear about winning numbers. The number of voters they need to get in order to win an election, they are very, very clear about it. So if you're clear about it, and then you bring that leadership team together and decide on what you want to work on, what the thing is, then you could put a campaign plan together. And like we teach campaign planning. You know, campaigns aren't that hard. You just got to look at a map. You got to look at the people in the areas. If you know in the city of Cleveland, like I know literally in the 9th ward in Cleveland, it literally only votes at like 16, 17%. Right. And you can go ahead, sir.
Let me ask you this. How do you spread your knowledge to the people of other people in other districts, other localities in Ohio? In other words, how do you share your experience, your knowledge, your insights, and the strategies that have worked, the lessons that you've learned? What kind of mechanism do you put together to say, for instance, we have a group of people here. I was talking to in the conversation with Dr. Bostic on Thursday, we talked about widening the circle of concern. So if you have our basic concern is to employ the electoral process as a strategy to leverage Black political power, right? That's how do we widen the circle of those who are committed to that process and can learn from each other, can learn from the experiences that have been gained in the past, and how to bring about creative strategies that will work in now and toward the future. Now, while I have your attention, so keep that question in mind, please. Okay. While I have your attention, I'd also like to go back to your cousin. All right. And there was I don't know if you were listening to the conversation in the afternoon panel yesterday or not.
No, I missed
but there was a conversation. Dr. Myla Cooper, I think, is on this conversation.
She wants to chime in.
Must be my cousin.
And at some point, she wants to chime in.
Yeah, I want to bring her in,
Yep,
and
right.
if she's still here,
Yes, she is.
and Randall McShepard was a part of that conversation, and I just want to introduce that because to plug into what you're saying, DeMario, because just like your cousin is your cousin, right? Might not know what propaganda is, but I know your cousin knows what woke is.
Yeah, at this point, right?
At this, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the experiences that I had in teaching students in Ohio in the congressional election that actually changed the makeup of the House of Representatives was in 2018. Is that right? Yeah, 2018.
Yeah,
It was an off year election.
Yeah.
So another thing to keep in mind in terms of strategy is how we raise the profile of off year elections.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Because we can't do this every 4 years and make a difference.
Yeah.
And we cannot leave out the local elections, and we cannot leave out the county elections.
Yep.
We cannot leave out the state legislator elections, right? So what you're talking about has to be comprehensive in terms of engagement in the electoral process. But that 2018 election made a big difference, right?
Yeah.
In terms of a lot of things have happened, wouldn't have happened that have happened if that election didn't turn out the way it did in terms of the House in 2018, right? So, but when I was talking to students about like how important this election was, and I heard this comment from students that was like that was trying to how can I say it, discourage voting.
Yeah.
And the comment was, people were saying we're too woke to vote. I'm saying, like, you too woke to vote?
Yeah.
I mean, what does that, how does that get in? I mean, you said like, okay, I'm not about voting. I mean, you said that yourself just a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
But I'm about how the electoral process or voting can be used as a strategy to leverage Black political power.
Yeah,
right?
that's what they're saying to you. When young people are saying that they're too woke to vote and stuff like that, what they're saying is they don't see the strategy. They don't understand it as a strategy.
Okay, then so that's what you're saying, and we got to really change that.
Yeah.
Because they do see the strategy, right?
Right.
Okay, so just and Dr. Cooper, please come in here because I'm going to refer to you. Is that there are young people who say there's no need of voting in a two-party system because you only have two choices, right? So it doesn't change anything. Things are just going to stay the way they are anyway. So we don't really have any choice. So there's no need of participating in a system where you have Democratic and Republican parties, right? So one of the strategies, though, in terms of thinking about the electoral process, is how you leverage Black political power within the framework of a two-party system, right? It can be done creatively. Even so, you can't accept the proposition that you only have two choices.
Yes.
Because that's not true. You have a wide range of options in terms of how you utilize that framework to increase your options. So there's a wide range of creative possibilities and strategies within the existing system that we don't utilize to leverage Black political power. But if we just write it off as saying, well, this is the way the system is, and it's not going to help us, it's not going to make any difference, so why even get involved? Because, like you said, We haven't put forth the strategies and the approaches that can actually maximize the leveraging of Black political power. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Nyla? I mean, Dr. Cooper?
Thank you, Dr. Butcher. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
I guess, I mean, I was thinking, I had a few thoughts quite some time ago. It wasn't necessarily around this current topic of um, political power. And I guess I just share a few of my thoughts. One was, some of the focus on history and historic movements. The fact that Rosa Parks wasn't just tired, and that people seem to not be aware of that historic movements involve strategy. And as if they are just out there. And some do. I mean, some folks just show up when they know it's a protest. They have their sign, they just want to be in the mix, but we need those foot soldiers there. And I would say that there are people who are involved in strategy. And the panel that I was involved in yesterday, I've vacillated between optimistic to, you know, pessimistic in terms of this crisis that we're in. And then we kept reminding ourselves of the positivity that's happening now. And so I think of some of our younger people. Cooper, you mentioned young people, and there are young people who are involved, and they are involved as strategists. Some of them are employing the same strategies that King and others used in nonviolence. I mean, you have the Ohio Student Association here in our state. They're doing phenomenal work, and you probably know about that through their collaboration with the Ohio Organizing Collaborative. And you have, someone like Tamika Mallory, who's fairly young, in her organization Until Freedom. And when you look at some of those young people who are going into and have been in Kentucky to protest the murder of Breonna Taylor, and lots of other places where they show up, they are using strategy. I mean, you can zoom into their meetings and look, they're using the same nonviolence principles and strategies that they did in the 60s. And so I would say that it is out there. It's prevalent. We may not see it collectively. So that was my first point. And then the other point was when we talked about you all were talking about silos, and we need a Black agenda, and how do we do this collectively. We're going to continue to need some of our silos, which I don't really describe them as that, but the various organizations that are working on, on different issues and different in different locales. But the national agenda, I'm interested in what some of the other folks here have to say about that. We're not in the 60s where we had the face of the movement, King, and all these other, like, we don't have a face of 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 the movement. And is that what we need? That's one possibility. Or do we need to support these grassroots organizations that are doing amazing work? And then lastly, I would say, in terms of the political involvement in voting. And I was the one yesterday who talked about some of the young people I work with, specifically on my college campus, but others who feel disenfranchised by the two-party system. Some of them lean really, really left, and they don't think either party, even the Democratic Party, meets the needs or addresses the values and issues that they do. But yes, I just mentioned some things that we talked about yesterday that I think can help with that. We need to take a hard look at the establishment versus emerging leaders and progressive leaders, and I'm talking about within the Black community. We do have an establishment, political establishment in our community that is really hard to crack. It's hard to get new voices and emerging leaders into that. It's, the same thing we do in a Black church in some cases. Wait your turn. It's this pecking order and this ladder you have to climb when there are younger people who are ready now. Then I think my colleague Randall McShepard mentioned yesterday, we have to hold our elected officials accountable. And so often we see those who are trying to get out the vote, as we should. Once we get our folks elected, or even when we lose, we just kind of wait until the next election.
Yeah.
We don't, you know, as far as what I see, I'm sure there are people who are doing it, but it's not seen in the same way as the get out the vote is, in terms of holding folks accountable. Even when they look like us, we seem to want to be hands off when it comes to that. So I think holding what are the strategies to hold our elected officials accountable, and then encouraging participation beyond voting, which includes part of that, but also, you know, you mentioned wards and city council. There are some women groups, you know, like She Should Run and Emily's List, that they have an entire strategy to get women, and it tends to focus on white women, but there are, you know, there are some people of color in that too. But where's our strategy to encourage our people to engage in the political process, whether it's holding folks accountable or running themselves? And then well, I guess that was next to last. And then the last thing I would say is the political the strategy to become involved politically is very important, but there's so many other issues, and we can't think that everyone is going to want to know everything about the city council budget, and you know, all of these things that you mentioned, Cooper, that some folks just don't know. But we need some folks on the ground dealing with our health crisis, with our education crisis. And so I think there's room at the table, and there's so many different issues that it's not all depending on, you know, who's the mayor and who's the governor. Now, I'm not saying those things aren't important, but if that makes sense, though, the strategy needs to be multifaceted, multi-layer, to deal with the crisis that we face as Black America.
Absolutely.
May I jump in? Oh, sorry.
Good.
I just want to jump in real quick just to add to that, because on what Brother Cooper was saying as well, is that's why I think Georgia may be, you know, example. Again, you did, as Brother Cooper reminded us, you had Stacey Abrams, Latasha Brown, you had long, you know, and deep roots of organizing that had been going on, but you also had, you know, the WNBA, you had Warnock in his various roles, who is also with a major established church as such as Ebenezer, who's also in academia. And so my point is, and I think I said in the notes, is what's the follow-up? Like what are the various integrated ways that through the Black church, through athletes and artists who have social media platforms, through educational and health institutions, through grassroots organizing institutions, how are we following up? And that's what my point was, is that the people who aren't a part of all of these interconnections, they got a sense. I mean, you saw people after that election in the midst of COVID exhaling in the streets because they realized the effect that their power can have. And that's what I'm saying. How are we getting in that moment? Because people have an understanding, okay, my power, even though these may not have been, you know, best selections, but something is happening that actually is impacting communities in positive ways because people stood up and made a change. And so I said in the notes, how are we, I mean, Reverend Barber is doing some of this, but how are we developing freedom school, Sunday school, vacation Bible study? How are we following up on sort of the maintaining in various spaces where people find themselves in community in the education and maintaining that sense of how people can continue to use their power and what it means in the interim? So that's sort of part of the silo piece. And I think I also said in the notes, the woke check thing, we need to, again, it's the complexity of it. And I appreciate Brother Cooper's point about what they're saying is strategy, but there's also this thing that's happening where we're dividing ourselves again. I'm too woke, you got this title, I'm this, that, you can't talk to me. You know, I got a title, but my parents are from Mississippi. Like so I know, you know, we all are multilingual. And so the way we set each other up, because of whatever we perceive, and then we do woke checks via social media when we don't even know the entire story of who, or even a bit of the story that people bring with them. So there's something else that's going on. I mean, there's a way in which there are elements that kind of manipulate those tactics in a way it's not going anywhere. You know, it's not, and you can't give them a strategy because they're not interested in that. They just want to keep checking folks because that's, you know, And so how do we, again, that's the way we got to wrestle these conversations that people sort of think, well, I'm woke, so I can't touch that.
Yeah.
So we got to deal with the complexity of what that means, hear what they're saying in that, but also we got to challenge people when that woke check thing is really just another exclusionary or divisive tactic that people have kind of gotten themselves into a power, that's a way they can kind of use their power, to get, I say like, it's sort of like when I was junior high. You remember you in junior high and we had a big parking lot so we could be away from the school, and someone would egg you on like, oh, I wouldn't take that if she said that. It sort of feels like that, like people egging you on just to keep, and it's not productive and it's not taking us anywhere. So that's what I just want to say about that. And I'm gonna shut up because I've talked enough today.
No, all this is good. All this is good. As I was listening to Dr. Cooper talk, I went back in my mind to 2010, to that off election of 2010, where you and your husband and I were working on the campaign, and we were out front in front of the voting area, and folk got mad at us because we was begging them to vote. But that 2010 off election campaign changed the face of Ohio. Mm-hmm. From gerrymandering, we lost representatives that may have been sympathetic to our cause. All of this thing happened in a quote unquote off election. Mm-hmm. So every election is on, every election is important. And besides the election, there's other things that needs to come out. And because I'm hearing you, Dr. Cooper, here in Akron, we have a 10-year plan, 10-year strategy for certain goals that we want to reach. But also I have a claim to area of urban farming and Black gardening for the whole state. I intend to organize a co-op where we grow our own food and all the way to the point of canning our food. And then secondly, I claim the area of home owner association as to step up from block groups, because homeowner associations can help build power and tell city council and get dollars from the city to do things in the community, to bring some things in and to take some things out. So I'll hush. Dr. Smallwood?
Well, this is some rich conversation here. Important pieces to focus in on. I really do like some of the strategies that Dr. Bostic has raised up. A large part of our stuckness when it comes to our churches is that we feel like we got to keep going right through the Bible on Sunday morning in Sunday school. We're reading the same stories over and over and over again. And it is a place where we could really infuse more of our racial and social justice causes. And it would not be antithetical to our faith. It would be right in line with what Amos talks about. Right in line with justice shalt thou pursue. And we need to really understand more clearly what is the message of the prophetic in the Bible. It is about justice, God's level of justice. But I did want to amplify a couple of things. When we think in terms of the strategies of old, Bayard Rustin was raised up. I really want us to get into this understanding of all hands on deck. So when I talk about silos, I'm not talking about that you have to be in a melting pot. I'm talking about coming out and creating synergy. You go back to your silo and keep doing what you're doing, but let's create the synergy that allows us to work together, to have a collaborative spirit. Because that's what that is the value of organizing. When we have connected, you can't organize if you don't have a relationship. You have to build relationality. We have gotten away from our traditional communalism. And that communalism, which is what Bruce started out with this morning, was what kept our people together. You know, and if you really think about King's letter from the Birmingham jail, it was in response to 5 or 10 white pastors who had written something in the news. Their public facing witness was to say, y'all Negroes get in line. Don't let these outsiders tell you what to do. We're giving you some justice. Just go through the courts and get it. And King took them to task. He took them to task using their own rules. That's what they did in Georgia. He took them to task using their own language. He carried them to theological school. So we need all kinds. We have to have the scholars at the table. We have to be able to go back to the Socratic method and talk about Thomas Aquinas and put it right back to them. And at the same time, we have to talk about being woke. You know what? D.L. Hughley has done a great job of public-facing witness. He took down Tim Scott in one of his little, from the GED section kind of things, because that's the woke check, right? That's what those preachers were doing. They were saying, listen, let me check you. You want progress, let us give it to you. And King was saying, no, we're gonna take it for ourselves. And so the strategy is about being together in this. You said, well, do we need a leader? No, I think the time for that is gone. But I do believe that if there's any one person in America right now who's taken up the mantle of King, it's Barbara. And I think he is beginning to fashion a particular national agenda.
Yes.
But there are others. You know, when you think about what's happening in the legislative realm, with a reparations bill coming out of committee, we got to prepare our people for economic justice. We got Black folks walking around here saying, oh, no, we don't need no reparations. We got a whole lot of Tim Scotts that need to be transformed and transfigured. You know, we got a senator from South Carolina talking about woke Negroes are worse than white supremacists. What in the hell does that mean? Thank y'all.
No, that's good. That is good. That is good. That is good. This is good because we're here.
Dr. Smallwood, what does that mean?
Go ahead. Good. Go ahead. This is
That's
talk
the
back.
check, right? That's the check that Joy brought up. You know, that's the same check that was happening in that letter they posted in the newspaper and King responded to. It is to say, come on, you don't need to be woke. What? The Southern Baptist said, critical race theory is antithetical to the Bible. That's bull.
Yeah.
They killed Jesus because he was a Jew. That is racism. There's another thing though. This is just from my point of view. This woke thing has a whole lot of different meanings. You know what I mean? And people are using it in a whole lot of different ways. So what kind of woke we talking about? You know what I mean? If they can take woke and use it against us, right? Then what does it mean to be woke? I mean, that's the question I have. If woke means you have given up on any possibility of change, and then woke means, on the other side, the change is something that you should not be engaged in. I mean, what is woke? I mean, how woke can be hijacked. Mm-hmm. So I'm just thinking, like, this is the thing, when movements can be hijacked,
yeah,
and flipped, yeah, and turned against themselves, right?
Well, that's exactly what they were saying. Listen, we got some of your leaders on with us. They said in the letter, you need to listen to your local leaders because they're listening to us. And if you listen to the local leaders and let these outsiders go back where they came from, we won't have all this tension. And King had to help them understand that tension is what moves. Mm-hmm.
Yes, creative tension is what he called it. That's what he called it. Yeah. Now, you bring up an interesting point, though, Dr. Smallwood, is what is the Black church's role in, because it's changed. When we went to St. Louis and did it, the Black church was not leading that protest. And when the Black church showed up, they got laughed off the podium because the Black church showed up at the very end, just like when John the Baptist was preaching in the wilderness and offering the baptism of repentance. the last ones to show up was the established church. And they didn't come to praise them. They came to observe them so they can cut them down. But now, I have the question, does the Black church have the same moral authority to lead the people that it's had in the past? Because it doesn't appear to me like it does. It appears to me like it is abrogated, it's usurped. I mean, it's gone.
Can I say
I don't
one thing real
agree
quick?
with that.
I'm sorry. Right.
All right,
But
that's why I'm putting it out.
How are you defining the Black church too? The Black church in the 60s primarily meant the Baptist church. It meant male leaders in the Black church. You know, you had concentrated efforts of, you know, in the movement in terms of, you know, who the leadership was. I don't think we have to necessarily mirror what happened. I do think there's a role and an obligation for Black Black churches, Black clergy to be involved in the liberation of Black people and to fight injustice. But if we're stuck on what it looked like then, we'll never get there because the landscape has changed significantly. We have an influx of non-denominational churches. You know, the Black church does not look like what it did, you know, 50, 60 years ago. And Tracy Blackman was front and center in Ferguson. She represents the Black church. And so when we just say the Black church is absent, we get that criticism all the time. Sometimes we give it versus looking at what some Black churches are actually doing. The Black Pact. I mean, what is that? That's the Black church. And so I think we get hung up so often on the criticism. We're our own demise in terms of what we are doing. Now, are there some black churches, Black denominations that aren't woke and aren't involved? And absolutely, but we can't be accountable for everybody. I think we need to focus on the strengths that we do have with those Black clergy, those Black laypersons who are involved in movements.
So real quick, one, I just want to give a shout out to all the Coopers on this call because we repping hard. And then the second thing, you said what? Second thing, I can't stay on that long, but there's a thing that I want to say, right? Like in a moment when we're dealing with police accountability and talking about like holding police accountable, I am wondering why the church in general, Black or other denominations, regardless, are not lifting up the fact that Jesus was killed by law enforcement. He was illegally captured. He went to a sham trial and got a mandatory minimum sentence, right? Like, I mean, like, why aren't we framing this conversation in that context right now? Because that's what's happening. State authority is what killed Jesus. Unaccountable, right? And it was only accountable to corporate input, right? Like it was accountable to the money, you know, and there's a way that we could be talking about what's happening right now that would help a lot of these young people, because I really do believe it's not that people, I'm 41. I got a lot of gray hair about 41 years ago, right? I earned my platinum, right? But my generation, we are not non-believers. We're not non-believers. You can go listen to any rap album, man. People believe, right? Like people know that they need God, right? We're not non-believers. The problem is, like, the conversation is not addressing the real threat that is happening, right? Like we're not contextualizing this threat. It's like, look, this is the same thing that happened to Jesus. Yeah. You feel what I'm saying? Like, it's the same thing.
But you bring up an interesting point, because many of my colleagues in the area in which I've served for 16 years do not have a political understanding, do not give the Gospels a political reading. I give them the book of Chad Myers, Binding the Strong Man, as an introduction to a reading, give a political reading of the Gospel, but many resist that. No, Doc, if you don't read, matter of fact, if you don't say the King James word, I'm not buying. I'm not getting into that.
Yeah.
Whereas, and if the shepherd is not getting it, don't feed the sheep just getting it by accident. So there's not a deliberate and intentional political reading of the Gospels.
Yeah.
Reverend Butcher.
Yes, Dr. Wiley.
Yeah, I want to refer us back to a conversation that took place during the keynote address.
Yes, sir.
And a concept or a construct that Dr. Bostic has developed that I think is a great way to think about the conversation that we're having now. And she talks about creating sacred spaces for emancipatory practices.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, sir.
Because we didn't go too deep into that. It's a lot of that has a lot of far-ranging implications. Just that construct.
Yes.
Dr. Bostic, one of the models that we have for creating sacred spaces is the hush arbor. The hush arbor, which is basically, and the brush arbor, hush arbor is called different things, which is basically the foundation of the Black church, is the hush arbor, right? Where enslaved Africans had to create sacred space for emancipatory practices. Now, those people, Christianity didn't even actually become an issue in the enslaved African community for 120 years. So what was happening there? I mean, what were people doing? What were their spiritual practices? What were their rituals? They were coming from different countries, different African traditional religions. Some were Muslims, some had been exposed to Christianity, some had all forms of spirituality and spiritual resources that they drew on, but they knew in terms of the spiritual resources that they needed in order to resist their enslavement, that they had to find a way to collectively draw on the spiritual resources that they had, right? And I look at now where the conversation that we're having, it's not to exclude any form of spirituality. It is to expand our understanding of the possibilities of creative spiritualities that are emerging, that might be in contrast to what we have previously known. Yeah. We have to allow for the possibility for those forms of spirituality to emerge as they emerge for a new generation, right? And to how that can be nurtured in a way that it can be connected to the spiritual legacy of the past, and how it can be actually used as a resource to sustain struggle as we go forward.
Yeah, that's interesting, Professor Wiley, because historically, when the Prosser revolt took place, one of the leaders of that revolt was a gentleman by the name of Gullah Jack. And he practiced African indigenous religion. In fact, he felt like as long as he had the claw of a certain crab in his jaw, he was invincible.
He was a conjurer.
Yeah, he was able to convince. He had a large following to go into that revolt, but based on his religious practices that was non-Christian. And so I'm saying that to say it's something that we have yet to tap into. And I think we don't tap into it because fear of it has been inculcated into us by the oppressor, because they didn't understand it and they feared it. They saw its power. They didn't understand it. They saw it was held in the hands of dark people, red, brown, black, but they convinced us that it was hoodoo and voodoo were not worth messing with.
And we have to also have to embrace the idea that the Christianity that has historically fashioned the spiritual legacy of Black people in the United States is not really what the mainline Christian culture actually embraces as Christianity. Yeah. You know what I mean? So it's a different manifestation of Christianity that has emerged in the context of enslaved Africans' way of shaping and forming that has grown out their historical experience. So what we call Christian has to also be critically examined.
Yes. And then,
Well, I'm
what?
sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, part of that is, yes, I mean, we have to understand that as the sort of Africana religious sort of aspect. And I go back to, when I talk about beloved, I'm not only talking about King, I'm talking about Toni Morrison's Beloved, and the Baby Sug sermon, Here in This Place We Flesh. But she begins that by, or at least the description of it is, the only grace you can have is the grace that you can imagine. And what that does is it opens up the way in which we think about that. Grace is not a particular kind of construct. And what you have in the Hush Harbor is a cosmology that speaks to, again, that connection between the born, the living, the dead, and the yet born. It is the way in which the value or the priority is equilibrium. Equilibrium in this life, equilibrium in our relationships. And so if anything is out of place with that, the practices that you bring in are about those relationships. Too often with Christian, sort of the Christianity that we've adopted, that has been adopted post the followers of Jesus, is about very specific individualistic relationships. And so we have to kind of look at how are we thinking about our organizing in ways that also does not exclude other practitioners, other kinds of religious perspectives in Black America. And so that Hush Harbor model, I mean, that's the same model that's in the ciphers in hip hop. It's the same model that's in the jam session in jazz. It's the same model that comes out of the groove in funk. That model shows up in all of our aesthetic practices. That's why art and music is such a powerful connector, because those same constructs that's in the Hush Harbor, the ways in which you pick up music, you adapt them to the particular situation, you improvise, you change leadership. Leadership is not based on gender. It's a communal, collective, collaborative, and you're always dealing with what's happening in the moment. And so that construct keeps showing up in all that we do. And so we can keep that, in our minds and in our sight. That can help us and think about grace as an open-ended kind of way of thinking about what can we imagine and not constraining or confining that. Then we can bring in people across difference in ways that can move us forward.
Now, I have this question based on a statement made by a reporter concerning the situation in Minneapolis. They said that George Floyd Park is a sacred space. So my question was, well, how to become a sacred space? How does sacred space become sacred space? I look in the Bible and I see wherever God meets human beings, the result of that becomes sacred. Maybe it started out as something, but when God meets, the divine meets humanity, it becomes sacred. I think about some of the songs that we consider in the Western Christian church today. They started out as drinking songs until God met them and changed and transformed the songs from drinking songs to songs we just consider so holy now. But it just seems to me something is just ordinary until the space and time where God enters. So I'm saying that because some people wonder, and I do myself sometimes, is sacred spaces the sole domain and control of the church? Or is it wherever God meets his people? Wherever God meets God's people, I'm sorry.
Let me weigh in on this.
Please.
Everyone who has breath, raise your hand. Sacred space. Let me say this. We've allowed sacred and profane to be binaries that are really unnecessary.
Right.
And because of it, we push people away that should be close. Understand and know that God is all in all.
All right.
And if we can just get our minds around that idea, we won't be so hung up on what's sacred and what's profane. We'll be much more clear on the fact that the devil is actually a servant.
I had a professor to point out to me that everything's sacred. Everything.
Well, you know, Dr. Bostic, again, referring to her work and her thinking, has a concept that's called, what she uses, she calls it social sacred. Or you can say sacred social. I mean, you can do it that way. I mean, to overcome that binary of social and sacred. But I think, which is really traditionally how African religions think of the cosmology. African cosmology does not make that binary split between the social and the sacred. All life is sacred. All creation is sacred. Yeah. I mean, and it's not divorced from living and how we interact, our social interactions either. You know what I mean? Every aspect of life has this social and sacred dimension to it. I mean, that's not, I mean, it's the Western construct that has divided that for us, that binary that she talks about. And we need to divorce ourselves from that way of thinking, actually, because it's contrary and in contradiction to who we are and how we live, right? So yeah, I agree with Dr. Smallwood. I mean, it's a false distinction for us, you know? But at the same time, I think, when it comes to struggles for justice and struggles for social transformation, and I'll just repeat what I said the other night, we have to understand the significance, the importance, and the legacy and of that has sustained us over time for spiritual nourishment, right? For drawing on the historical, drawing on the well of our spiritual resources, right? To sustain movements over time. I mean, people who have been in struggle for 400 years, right? And who know that we're going to have to be in struggle for 6 or 7 generations after us and then on beyond. We have to be conscious of the legacy that we inherit, the spiritual, in terms of the spirituality that and the spiritual resources that can sustain us over time. So again, I'm just using Dr. Bostic as my as my resource here. But again, you know, without constraining the spirit, right? Not locking it up, you know. I've often said when I teaching at Payne to my students, you know, I mean, let's open ourselves to the mystery and the possibility of new things emerging. You know, I refer to that passage in because people talk about the word and the word of God. And I refer to that passage from Paul, where Paul says the word of God is not chained. It's not bound. You can't restrict it. You cannot contain it. It's not, human beings have no way of actually imprisoning the word,
Why
the spirituality.
Trying to do that?
Huh?
Why do we spend so much time in the church?
And that's wasted energy.
But we've been socialized. We've been socialized around those constraints. We have to understand how it is that Christianity itself was meted out, and then the capacity for us to integrate our own African cosmologies helped to open us up some, but a lot of us have really ingrained ourselves with a sort of slave mentality and in those narrations. So we're still there. We're still reciting, you know, the catechisms, and they are locking us down. But I do want to raise a couple of things. You know, our ancestors sung the song, "Can't Hear Nobody Pray."
Way down yonder.
You know, there are dimensions to the spirituality. If you get in a place where you can't hear nobody pray, that is a dimension that allows you to operate in a spirit that takes your moans and your groans and interprets them. But then there are places we can get to. There are realms and depths that we can get to where when Dr. Bostic talks about the ancestors are coming. It's a question of whether or not we're in position to hear them.
Yeah.
Right. So in part, then, our churches have some heavy lifting. We've got some heavy lifting to do. We've done too much performativity. We got to get in a place where we're training our folk how to be disciplined enough to hear the Spirit, to communicate in a way that we're no longer just trying to speak truth to power, but we are speaking truth in power.
Yes. All right. I was just looking at something that was dropped in the chat, but that's good. That's good. And then it brings me to a point that was made, I believe it was yesterday, about us tapping in. Somebody said, I'm not my ancestor. And I heard that, but I am my ancestor. In fact, you can't kill us because I represent everything that you try to do. I'm still here. But I think we diminish that point about tapping into that great cloud of witnesses and to touch in to those souls and spirits that have gone on to move forward, who want to help. They can see us and know us, but we got to cry out to them and call on them and beseech them for the help that we need. I think we do very little of that. In part, we pay some homage to our ancestors, but I think being in dialogue and commune with them. I have a room in my house, my living room is my ancestor room. It has the pictures of all the ones that have gone on home to glory, but I sit there in that room silently where I can commune with them because they can tell me something that I don't know.
I put in the chat yesterday when someone mentioned that about we are not our ancestors. And I mean, they have memes and t-shirts and, basically, you're going to catch these hands. I mean, I know this jargon working with my students but they're referring to a specific movement. They're talking about King and that movement and nonviolence and how they're not going to turn the other cheek in their violence. But, I've come back to that and say, you're absolutely right. You are not. And I talk about the sacrifices that our ancestors made, the long haul, the long suffering, the things that not all, but some in this generation and even us, we're not in terms of, I can, you were talking about flipping it and in terms of, Dr. Wiley was talking about how they use the woke jargon and turning on us. Well, there's a comeback or a clapback to young people who want to say we're not our ancestors too. Ultimately, I believe, the right response in what we're all saying. We stand on the shoulders of those who, made it possible really for us to be here. But I think also putting it back on them about the strengths of our ancestors that we don't always see today.
In other words, no truer word spoken. You're not your ancestors. You ought to look into trying to be something like them.
Yeah. And then even back to the civil rights movements under King and that type of leadership, it was and especially the organizing work of SNCC, this nonviolent stuff was very violent. And them old wise folk, you go to their house, to their cabin, you wonder why they got a shotgun in every corner, because they understood. They gonna let you talk at nonviolent talk, but they understood what time it was, and they also and you ought to listen to Fannie Lou Hamer and what she had to say about that. And so we need sometime, and what thing racism does is it smears or eliminates our collective memory and history, and it tries to soften it towards this end. But we need to dig into that because our folk was packing.
Yeah,
hoping that some mess go down, so we can go on and show up.
Another thing about that, Reverend Butcher.
Yes, sir.
Is that in so many ways, our history, our struggle, our legacy has been defined for us, right? And a lot of that, the young people have inherited. a history, a struggle, a legacy that has been defined for them by but not by them, or by not the people, Black people themselves, right? To put it that way. So we have to recognize that part of that, when I was emerging as a young person in the 1960s in college, and the Black Power movement and all of that, and the struggle for Black studies and everything, part of that struggle was to counter the notion that Black people didn't have a history.
True.
That Black people didn't have a culture.
True.
There was nothing to pass on. And if there was anything that was remaining, it was something that you should be ashamed of, and that you should be divorced from, and that you should not have any connection to.
And many of us work to do that very thing.
Yeah, and the only option you had was to become like those who were the represented your oppressors, or who were the ones that were keeping you in a position of enslavement. And so I think that's part of the understanding too. Where does that come from somebody saying, I am not my ancestors? I mean, who I think Dr. Bostic asked that the other night. Who told you that?
Well,
I mean, go ahead.
I think it's connected to the idea that our ancestors was meek and mild and accommodating and submissive to white supremacy, without looking at the ongoing struggle of it, and even appearing to be docile sometimes because it was a tactic.
And who told you that? Who told you? I mean, I'm talking about you, Bruce.
Yeah.
I was saying, who told you?
Well, they also look at their predicament, the current predicament of Black people. And when, if they look at what came before them in terms of, the different movements and fighting for liberation and justice, well, why are we still in why are we in this position that we are in now? So something about what they didn't work. I mean, that's part of the framing of young people. Most of it, honestly, is the violence and nonviolence, and what they say they will take and what they won't take. That's what I hear.
But if you look at the situation of slavery, Black people could have asked that question many times over. Why are
They're asking that too.
I'm just saying, but why are we still enslaved? That's a question. I mean, that's a legitimate question, but it's not legitimate to say we're enslaved because we are accepting of it. That's not part of our history, that we just embrace, that we're docile and submissive, and there was no struggle for resistance or to end and to struggle against that system and to bring it down. As a matter of fact, when you look at the slave rebellions, when you look at the culture of resistance that actually is not a part of the historical narrative that our young people are inheriting, but how is it that they get the one where we're docile and submissive and just because we're still fighting against structures of oppression?
Yes.
I mean, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because that's not who is transferring that historical narrative to our young people, as opposed to a historical narrative that actually says, no, we were, when African people were in the Middle Passage, people jumped off of the ships rather than to be enslaved. Yes. When you're talking about there were slave rebellions on the ships.
Yes.
Actually. You know what I mean? There were rebellions from the middle. There were forms of rebellion from the Central Africa to the coast.
Yeah, every step.
I mean, Vincent Harding. That's the name of his book. There is a river, and the river that runs through our experience and our historical legacy is one of resistance to slavery and oppression, not one of docility and submission and acceptance of our oppression. So I'm just saying that we have to assume or embrace our responsibility to transfer from one generation to another a historical narrative that actually reflects the legacy of genius, of courage, of spiritual power that has sustained this struggle for 400 years. And sure, we're still in the struggle, but you know, there's only one way to actually deal with that, is to continue to engage in our continually emerging forms of liberation.
But also the choices that people did to survive, which is the reason why we're still here. And so that's a problem with a meme. A meme sort of sounds good, it looks cute, and it's compact, but it doesn't allow you to think about it or tell that whole story. And so it is indicative of not knowing that history. So, but it's not also when people sort of self-defended themselves and fought back and used force. But I also want to push back against distancing ourselves from people who had to make very difficult decisions because they wanted to stay here for their children. And what that means as a part of that too. You know, people who have had to face indignities and make very difficult choices so that their families could survive. So I just wanted to say that as well. We miss all of that story. And again, it takes off. And that's what my question is that you can make the statement you want to fight back without distancing yourself from your ancestors. You're here because of, you're only here breathing because of your ancestors. Regardless of the choices they made, you're not here but for them. And so we can have that conversation about those sort of different strategies and the difficulties of it. But I think, again, I just always push back on anything that divides us. And particularly when someone from the outside, or we don't know who the source is telling us how to look at, view folks within our families or within our communities without letting them tell their own stories and engaging. That's what my whole piece was: positionality, relationality, and mobility. Is that we have to look at our positions in terms of where we are located. We have to look, but also we have to take seriously those relationships and how do they move out. You don't have to make the same choices. But my whole thing is like, well, if you're gonna catch hands, just say you're gonna catch hands. You don't have to bring the ancestors in. Like, oh, I'm not there. Well, go on with your bad self and go do it then. Just go do it. Let me see. I want to see it. Call me when you do it. Send me the video. But anyway, I've never said that to anybody, but I'm just joking here.
Dr. Bostic, also, I think that has been a tension too, just to be in terms of the dialogue and the emergence of womanist theology and Black theology. And I know Dr. Dolores Williams in Sisters in the Wilderness raises up the story of Hagar. And as opposed to the Exodus story, right? Mm-hmm. So that kind of tension is a creative tension that actually positions liberation and survival in dialectical tension with each other, because they're and not in oppositional tension, but in dialectical tension. Because so the way out of that kind of conversation, I've had to think about it a little differently myself, because number one, liberation is part and parcel of the struggle. Survival is part and parcel of the struggle for liberation. And liberation is part and parcel of the struggle for survival, right? So survival, like you're saying, is really critical, because if we don't survive, we're not able to engage in any struggle for liberation. And no struggle for liberation cannot proceed without any concern or focus on our survival, right? And that's what we're facing right now at this day and time. So I just wanted to make that point.
Because none of this is linear.
Right.
But it
Yeah,
all is
so
spiritual. It all has a spiritual
yeah.
dimension, right?
Mhm.
You know, when the enemy gets so bold as to give the breath back to God,
Woo!
to press the very breath of life out of someone's body and say, here, God, take your breath. The depth of that kind of evil can't be stopped with a bullet. There's a different dimension that we must tap
Come
into
on. Mhm.
that gives us the power. Too much of our church work is a form of godliness without the power.
Uh-huh. Amen. We are winding down on the time that's allotted to us, but I want to put this before you, and I probably will put it in the chat for your consideration as we develop. We continue in dialogue and conversation, and we develop strategies for our people. I would like for you to consider the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, organized by Fannie Lou Hamer and others. See what their impact on the 1964 Democratic Convention and the state of Mississippi. I would ask you to study the Montgomery boycott. That was a boycott that was sustained over a year and effectively transformed the city of Montgomery. I also would urge us to consider in our strategies the use of boycotting as a tool, because I'm not too optimistic about the use of moral persuasion to white supremacy. But I can, if you're gonna respect my person, you're not getting my dollar. And I have seen the thing to make a dent in this white supremacy, even if it's temporary, is green. So I ask for us to study and suspend the propaganda efforts on this group, but the Black Panther Party for self-defense and how it came into being out of necessity for white terrorism at the hands of the police. So I lift those up as some models to study as we move forward in this debate and dialogue. I would like to say in closing, it's been interesting. I've picked up from this, we must organize. We must institutionalize. We must educate, and then we must build bridges to our spirituality, however means it is, through prayer, through meditation, through just waiting on the Lord, to returning to the brush harbor and turning the kettle over so the master can't hear us, the oppressor can't hear us, and cry out to God all of our burdens and pains, and lay it at the feet of the Lord. So having said that, I'm thankful again for this opportunity to moderate, and I will yield to Dr. Smallwood or to Professor Wiley for closing remarks.
Let me just say, this has been a rich conversation. It's stimulated me in so many ways. There are those on the call who have been exceptionally quiet. And I would like to yield the floor to Dr. Dean, Mr. Shah, Mr. Thompson. If you have anything, and Randall has been vocal in the chat, but he hadn't said very much. If you all have any closing thoughts, we welcome them. And if you don't, that's okay. I just want to give that vent to you.
It's a pleasure to meet everyone. I thank you all. This has been a very fruitful dialogue. I'm a assistant professor at Denison University, but I also serve on the editorial board for the Columbus Dispatch. And one of the reasons I'm on that board is because they were looking to diversify the voices in the Columbus area and the Ohio area of speaking about the things and ills that were happening within the community. One of the things I've done since I've joined that board is I want to bring more other other members to the conversation, because I realize I can't be the only voice. Like my voice, I don't have that much power to speak for the Black community, but I also was very intentional because I created a series with the Dispatch called In Black and White. Because terms such as white supremacy, white patriarchy, anti-Blackness, anti-racism were floating in the ether, particularly with the Black Lives Matter movement that recently happening, George Floyd. I realized that, and as the brother who was speaking to Mario was saying, how he was using the term propaganda, the general public don't necessarily understand what white supremacy means. The general public don't necessarily understand what white patriarchy means, because, and I appreciate Professor Butcher's stating this, but I push back and say, you know, I resist using those terms, because what it does is it lets off a whole slew of white folks who would sit up here and say, well, I'm not a white supremacist. I'm not participating in white patriarchy. And it lets off all of those white women who voted Donald Trump into office. So what I say, we got to start naming those types of things. So what I'm asking scholars, what I'm asking for laypersons to do in Columbus is to tell the story, put it in layman's terms. What does white supremacy really mean in your everyday experience? What does anti-racism look like to you in your everyday lived experience? So I've been soliciting scholars from Ohio State. I got Kevin Magruder from Antioch College, so I saw Dr. Cooper here. And I've gotten other scholars to talk and share, what is it about the everyday Black person's experience that makes it anti-racist, that makes it anti-Black, that makes it white supremacy? What does that look like? So I would like to solicit you all who are on this call to please reach out to me, or I can reach out to you, because I really would like to get you to write an op-ed for the Dispatch, to tell the story, to put it in layman's terms, what these terms mean, to help flatten that conversation so that we don't let off a lot of people who are in this conversation that says, I am not participating in anti-Blackness. So then that way we won't see the recurring of a Ma'Khia Bryant happening again.
Thank you so much. Anyone else?
Dr. Smallwood, this is Randall McShepherd. I just wanted to thank you and all of the wonderful folks that are a part of this discussion for the opportunity. I have been taking copious notes, and I'm very inspired by what I heard. I just wanted to touch on a couple of items really quickly. One, the whole idea of civics for young people, I think was lifted up earlier. We really do need to understand that if we don't teach young people the importance of civics, they won't carry it forward and do the good work that we're all talking about in terms of organizing, mobilizing, voting, et cetera. Secondly, just to give as an example, I mentioned on the panel yesterday, I'm the chairman and co-founder of a Black think tank here in Cleveland. And one of the things that we've done successfully since this meeting was started out with, solutions as a focus, we actually have run in neighborhoods public policy and advocacy training classes where we get grassroots folks to sort of understand what is public policy, why does it matter, how do you make change happen, how do you take issues to your local elected official, how do you get 5 or 6 people together to go to City Hall, and the impact that kind of a thing makes. So I think those kinds of steps can go a long way in making a difference, and we should consider it as we move forward. In terms of the point that was made about the two parties and people saying, I don't like either, so I'm not going to pick. I would challenge those folks to also remember that there are issues such as levies and funding of things like libraries and school districts. That aren't necessarily Republican or Democratic issues. They just are issues that affect quality of life in our community. So it's not always the R or the D question that we need to challenge our young people to think about. And then I have to go back to something that Dr. Cooper was talking about, because we talked about it on the panel yesterday, this whole issue of young people being locked out. I wrote a research report, as I mentioned yesterday, that was titled "Missing in Action." And we talked about the 4 types of power. And I made the observation that political power was the first real form of power that Black folks had in this country, certainly looking at Northeast Ohio. And what happened, Cleveland, Ohio, with Mayor Stokes being the first Black mayor of a major US city, it led to other people becoming, council people. And for a very, very long time, they sort of controlled the power base. And I always have believed that we were so consumed with political power that we took our eye off the mark in terms of economic power. And I believe that political power and economic power are inextricably linked. We can't have one without the other. Harry Belafonte was raising a lot of money to get people out of jail during the civil rights movement, as an example, right? So I just think that we need to be mindful of the fact that young people, because they couldn't get into the capture the attention of the political power that was held by Black leaders in their community, simply moved on, started getting jobs as professionals, making lots of money, and sort of came to the conclusion, I don't need to fight my way to the table with these few elected officials that don't want me around anyway. I now see what I can do with my money and my resources, and I think that has contributed to the problem as well. So just wanted to share those thoughts. Thank you all for your time and attention, and have a blessed day.
Thank you so much.
I'd like to say something, okay, just a few. From my connection is through Howard Wiley. We were undergraduate students at Hiram College. And then I was at Kent State and never dreamt of going to the world of teaching. And Dr. Edward Crosby is the one who asked me to teach a class with Ron Daniels. And I'm not sure whether he's still in the Youngstown area or not. And then I just continued in academics, and I retired from Winston-Salem State University up here in North Carolina. My experience has been that in communicating with others, there is a kind of a barrier that's created. It's in the form of rationalizations. And in order to make an impact on others, we have to kind of smell the rationalizations, just like incense. You don't know what the name of the incense is, but you know it's there. And once you smell that rationalization, my communication has to be to see if I can break through those rationalizations, okay? Otherwise, the conversation just goes way all over, and there is no end to it. And I'll give you an example. In 1982, I was back at Kent State, and I had a large class in 82, yes. Reagan was the president. Okay, the large class of state and local government. I had 84 students. And I looked at that particular quarter, and I said, my God, this is going to be a rough one. These kids are all bored. They are here because it's a required course. But their minds, what the hell am I going to do? And so in the second class period, I just went on the chalkboard and I said, okay, what does the word politics means to me? I said, just tell me, give me a gut response, because I want to know where their heads were, you know. And their status, first thing that came out was boring, corruption, sex, manipulation, power, etc., etc. And I stopped at 14, examples. And I said, oh, hey, you guys, all of you are expert in man-woman relationship, man-man or woman-woman relationship, whatever your choice is. Please tell me, what's all that about? And the bloody list looked identical. Boring, no, the boring was not there. Exciting, power, manipulation, control, violence, drugs, everything else came in. So I said, wait a minute, please help me. Why is this one list boring activity and this other one is exciting? And then I pursued, and the reason I brought that up is because this business about woke culture is also tied up to a form of rationalizations. In other words, it's a cover up for something else. And unless, okay, I'm going to keep my mouth shut now. Unless our communication penetrates through those rationalizations, we think we are communicating, but that's not happening. But it was thank you very much for having the opportunity.
Dr. Shaw, real quick, could you define what you mean by rationalization, just in a quick term there? I mean, just break it down a little bit.
For me, the rationalization in the case of what the students were saying, their excuse for not paying attention to politics was because it's corrupt, okay? It's full of bullshit. It doesn't have any meaning, etc. And so a lot of the activities, people are, not participating because they have, embedded values in their own action, okay? And somehow, there is no recipe. I'm not giving you any recipe, and that's the last thing. But somehow those rationalizations have to be smashed. It doesn't have to be brutal, but in a nice, polite, clever way, so that when the conversation ends, there's, oh, that's the hell what Subhash trying to tell me. And sometimes they will make the connection a few years later, okay? But they will make the connection, okay? And that's what I mean by, it's a kind of complex ways of looking that becomes barrier for inaction. See? So in this case, if I view politics as boring, that gives me a perfect excuse not to vote, etc. And then I have a kind of a cocky attitude towards those individuals who take politics, seriously. So I think in all communications, so I think whether it's in any realm, so, okay, I'll keep quiet. Thank you.
Dr. Shaw, that was prolific. Thank you. I tend to get at that issue from the perspective of narratives. Whose narrative is in your mouth? Mm-hmm. And how do you drill down to the lowest common denominator? So when I invoked the catechisms earlier in our conversation, I was talking about the fact that sometimes the only narrative in our mouth is what has been given to us from a plantation mentality. And that mentality then helps us rationalize what is and is not good, bad, correct, wrong, those kinds of things. So I love the way you put that. And thank you so much. That is food for thought. Theodore, you're the last voice today. You have anything you want to share?
I'd like to share that I have enjoyed the presentations from someone who is involved in many social groups. I kind of see myself as making partners, forming alliances between groups. And so I hope that I can, of the many groups that I'm involved in, I hope that I can make this group an alliance as well, so that we can, at some point, come out of our individual silos and form a collective cohesive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for giving a good portion of your Saturday morning to us, or all of your Saturday morning, really. But thank you for hanging in here with us and being a part of this effort. It is just a starter, but it's on you. I'm happy to have been a part of the catalysm that brought it about. But I can tell you point blank, if I were ever to find myself living in Ohio, I would want to be associated with every single one of you. So praise God for you. You are a gift to the body of Christ, or to whatever communion you find yourself a part of. And we at Vanderbilt consider you our collaborative partners. Have a wonderful day. Good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smallwood.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone. Love
Blessings to
y'all.
everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, Bruce.
Take
care.
care.
Butcher.